One criticism that I hear all the time is, well, the first thing that happens when you mention Marx to a non-Marxist is something like this. Marx is the biggest failure of academia or economics because he's directly responsible for the deaths of millions with the catastrophic failures of the Soviet Union, China, Cambodia, and so on. And because I'm not educated about Marx, one of the biggest surprises for me that came from reading your work is that I had not realized that Marx never said much about what should happen after capitalism. He was more concerned with just criticizing capitalism. And if this is true, then I think that's a huge misconception, because lots of anti-Marxists hold him personally accountable for Stalin, the communist Chinese genocides, and so on, as if he directly wrote up their socioeconomic policies.
Yeah, let me respond. I mean, I agree with you. I won't go over saying it. Marx never wrote a book about communism. He never wrote a book about socialism. The one title that has the word socialism in it, a pamphlet really more than a book, was called Socialism, Utopian versus Scientific, a short book, you can call it, released in the middle of the 19th century. Was mostly written by Engels, but Marx had some play in it. But it was a critique of different kinds of socialism. It wasn't about a, quote, socialist economy. As I say, the only effort at a socialist economy that happened in Marx's lifetime and did get his attention was the Paris Commune. But that was a socialist society that lasted, I don't remember exactly, but somewhere on the order of 3 or 4 months in Paris. And then it was overthrown by the returning French army under Napoleon, the nephew and grandson of Napoleon. Anyway, holding Marx responsible would be roughly as follows. From the year, let's say, 1500 to 1800, there were countless wars between Christians of one kind or another and either other Christians, Protestant versus Catholic, for example, or if you go back a little earlier, wars of Christians against Muslims, the so-called Crusades, and so on. The leading armies of these Christians took their inspiration, they said so, from the Bible, from the utterances, as best we can get them, of Jesus Christ, among others, as recorded in the Bible. So I should what? Conclude that I shouldn't be a Christian because millions of people were killed, because they were, in the Crusades and in the 100 Years' War, 30 Years' War, all the wars of Protestants and Catholics which shaped modern Europe were all done in the name of Christianity. Are you going to blame the Christians? It's bizarre. The worst war in the history of the world so far, in terms of the sheer brutality, deaths, is the First World War. Tens of millions of people, combatants and civilians, were killed. These were wars by countries that were Christian. All of them. On all sides. There were no appreciable Marxists in those days, and they didn't have any power, though those that were might have called themselves that. So what should I say? Capitalism kills millions? Here's another one. For the last, 8 centuries, the world has been beset by something called colonialism. Huge portions of the world, Asia, Africa, Latin America, were invaded, taken over, and run by white Christian people, whether you're talking about India or Africa or you name it. In the course of that, Tens of millions, probably more like hundreds of millions of people died, directly or indirectly, because of what these Christian people did. Should I say Christianity has on its hands the blood of... I mean, I could do that. There is some sort of link here, but Marxism or socialism have no special standing in this kind of argument. There's nothing unique. Did the killings in Russia or elsewhere done by people who saluted Marx show that there's some link? Yeah, there's some link. Just like I did between Christianity or the writings of Jesus Christ, etc., etc., in colonialism, World War I, or for that matter, World War II. Let's remember, World War II, every combatant country, with one exception, was capitalist. The one exception, the Soviet Union. They weren't. But they were not the only player in World War II. Remember, it was mostly about the United States, Britain, and Western Europe against Germany, Italy, and Japan. So all of those countries are capitalist countries. So capitalism, the era of capitalism, has been by far the bloodiest. I would tend to connect that dot to the other dot. So I find it always this bizarre logic in which you find a link between Marxism in Russia, Stalin, and all that, and terrible things that happened there. It seems to me very reasonable to say, hey, terrible things happened there. Why did they? What is the link between the terrible things that happened and the ideological framework of that society? Perfectly reasonable question. I wrote a book in my life called Class Theory and History, which tries to explain how and why in the Soviet Union those things happened. I think that's a reasonable demand to put on anybody, Marxist or not. But then to play the game as if these horrors was something done by the people you don't like or don't agree with, whereas you are sitting in the beautiful, clean, vanilla chair explaining this, that's disgusting. That's beyond, that doesn't need a refutation. That needs to be ridiculed. And I don't want to offend anyone. On the other hand, I'm trying as politely as I can to say that is a cheap shot that tells us more about you than it does. You know, there's a fellow named Jordan Peterson. You may know him. He goes around repeating this. And what I love about it, he's not unique, but I like the way he does it because he does it as if it's a settled matter. It's that style of an argument in which, in order to make your case, you act as if everybody in the world understands this thing you're about to repeat, so that your opponent should feel not just that you are in disagreement, but the whole universe. Everybody knows. The minute you hear that from anybody, Marxist, non-Marxist, you should reach for your wallet before that guy gets his hand in it, because this is a hustle and it's not serious kind of debate.
It is entirely anti-Popperian in a sense. I mean, the capitalist governments, as you said, they're also responsible for unimaginable death and destruction, yet the critics I was referring to totally neglect this evidence and focus on Russia, China, etc., as if these were the only instances of crimes against humanity.
It's really, it's beyond words. And especially, both China and Russia, they're socialist governments, which leave loads to be desired. I'm a critic of them. I've written, all of that. But put that aside. Both of those socialist societies, as they define themselves, came out of revolutions against unbearable social conditions, all of which seems to be forgotten. If you're interested in where the Chinese Communist Revolution comes from, there's an American missionary, a woman named Pearl Buck, who wrote a famous novel 50 years ago, or however when it was, called The Good Earth. Just read how China was before the revolution. The deaths every day, the misery for centuries. That's what the revolution was against. You want that revolution, which had some violence in its unraveling and many injustices, no doubt. But where are you coming from with this bizarre from on heights declaration? The minute you talk to folks, you discover they have no idea where this Russian revolution came from, where this Chinese revolution. Why do you think people have revolutions? Because things are going real well? It's when they're not. And then you have to wonder, well, what does that mean? Gee, well, it turns out it means lots of suffering for a long time for many people. Now the whole numerical calculus of who hurt how many people when becomes fuzzy. And your invocation of this fuzziness, as if it weren't fuzzy, as if all the bad news was over here and there was nothing else to worry about, to think about, again, that reflects on you, not on the situation you're talking about. So anyway.
So granted that Marx did not advocate some particular post-capitalist form of economic or political organization, I mean, the question arises, though, just how we should interpret the failures of many of the attempted purported instantiations of his theories. And I'm wondering if what you're suggesting is that much of the suffering should be attributed to the conditions of what came before. But I'm also wondering if any aspects of these...
No. I didn't say that, and I don't want to be understood as that.
Oh, okay. Clarify that, please. Sorry.
Clarify. No, I think it's a lapse. It's a cheap shot. It's not valid, and it involves erasing other kinds of history that would make what you're saying ridiculous. So you avoid recognizing. So that's out. No, I think there are failures. The word is a little messy, but okay, there are failures in the Soviet Union, and there are failures in the People's Republic of China, or for that matter, North Korea, Cuba, Vietnam, or any of the other countries that nowadays...
Wait, Richard, just to make sure that I understand, you were saying that as opposed to attributing the suffering that happened in these regimes to what happened in the past, what you were just saying is that we can't act as if this was what happened in these regimes was the only bad thing. I mean, things were terrible prior to the communist revolutions, too.
No, but that was a secondary point. My major point was, if you want to play the game of counting deaths, then count them everywhere.
Yeah, okay, great.
That was stop this game in which you think you've achieved something by pointing to them and their bad story, their bad facts, their horrors. Unfortunately, the horrors are all over the place, and you're not coming from a place that is clean and viewing a place that is dirty. That's a convenient way to advance your political agenda, but it holds no water.
Okay.
Well, let me
great.
In order to understand how to go about talking about Stalinism or deaths or any other negative quality, you have to kind of ask yourself what this reference is, which I get to. Socialism has failed. What are you talking about? Let me give you an example of why this makes no sense. If you were, and there are studies that can back me up if you want them, if you were to ask the majority of the people on this planet at any time over the last 75 years, what's the number one priority of your society? The answer would be, we want to stop being poor. We want to stop being the way most of the people in Asia, Africa, and Latin America are, which is without huge portions of what people in the United States take for granted. Food, clothing, shelter, education, transportation, all of that. Okay. So the highest priority is to develop your economy and your society so that average people are healthy, can live a reasonable long time, get a good education, have their health care taken care, etc. Okay. Now let me put on my hat as an economist. Okay? Over the last 40 years, from the 1980s to the present, one country in the world has grown faster than all others. No one's close, and they were the largest country on this planet. They went from being one of the poorest countries in the world to now challenging the United States. It's the People's Republic of China. In terms of the highest priority those people had in their poverty situation 100 years ago, socialism is the best thing that could happen to them. And they know it. And their regime is very solid and very secure because of it. Real wages in China over those last 40 years have quadrupled. A real wage is when you adjust the money a person gets as pay for their work in terms of the prices they have to pay when they use the money. So the real wage measures how much can you really get to consume from whatever your wage is. Over the same 40-year period, the wages, average real wage in the United States went up about 10 to 15%. Let me do that again. The real wages in America, on average, went up 10 to 15% over 40 years. The real wages in the People's Republic of China over the last 40 years went up 400%. Do you think there's a difference here? Who's failing? What are you talking about? By the way, I'm not endorsing Chinese society. Are they full of criticism? Do they have flaws? Absolutely. But the make-believe that goes into the kind of logic you're talking about is based on a carefully cultivated ignorance. It's just ignorant. They have no idea what happened in China, nor do they care. They need to affirm one is good and one is bad. Childish. It's really childish. By the way, in the 20th century, the most spectacular economic growth was achieved by the Soviet Union. In 1917, at the time of their revolution, they were one of the poorest backwaters of Europe. Anyone who had ever traveled there, chronically, there was 5% of the people were literate. Everybody was a peasant in the country. There were no roads. There was no electricity, all of that kind of stuff. And within 70 years, and despite 2 world wars fought on Russia's surface, on its land, they were the number one contestant of the United States. Okay, does that mean the Soviet Union was wonderful? Of course not. But when you use the word failure, what's your standard? What's your metric? Where do you come from with this? You know what this is? This is just hostility, which, by the way, may be justified. I'll never know. But what's coming at me is noise, junk, silly stuff that you kind of ought to be ashamed is coming out of your mouth. I don't mean you personally, but someone who says that sort of stuff. It's really kind of childish. By the way, today the world economy, let me just be very topical with you for a moment. The world economy today is different from what it was 10 years ago, let alone 20 or 40. After World War II, the United States dominated the world economy. The United States was, as Marxists like to say, hegemonic economically. This is a footnote. Hegemony as a concept to govern all this, that's a concept that was developed in its modern form by a Marxist, an Italian Marxist, named Antonio Gramsci, who was imprisoned by Mussolini and basically killed in prison. But he was the leading Marxist, Italy, the most important Marxist theorist ever produced in Italy, and it's produced a lot of them. Gramsci developed, while he was in prison, books you can get. Columbia University Press in the United States has a complete collection of, I think, a dozen volumes of the writings while in prison of Antonio Gramsci. By the way, footnote, because people will find this interesting. The edited volumes of Mr. Gramsci were, the volumes were edited by a man named Buttigieg, who was a professor. He's passed away. He was a professor of literature at Notre Dame University in Indiana, Joseph Buttigieg. He had a son named Peter Buttigieg. Peter Buttigieg, a spokesperson for the Biden regime, comes from a family whose father dedicated a major part of his life to the translation and publication of the works of Antonio Gramsci, who was for a while the head of the Italian Communist Party. Here in the United States, you'll find people who know and use the work of Gramsci, including the concept of hegemony, having carefully avoided learning where it comes from, what context it works within, what intellectual tradition it depends on, etc., etc., etc. The influence of Marxism is everywhere. And one of the reasons people don't understand it is because often the people who have it in them find it is necessary in this strange country to hide it. I'll give you another example, because there's a certain twinkle in your eye that suggests I should go further with this. Kamala Harris is the vice president. She has a father named Donald Harris. He's a Marxist economist that I have worked with much in my life. He used to be a professor at Stanford. One of the few Marxists that Stanford dared bring into its framework. But who admits what they complicated? All right, let me go back to where I was. So if your metric is economic growth in a society that says that's our number one priority, then socialism isn't a failure. Or you have to qualify that somehow. You can't say socialism is a failure as if somehow this makes any sense, because I just gave you a framework within which it's wrong. It just makes no sense at all.